Hello, everyone. My name is Gaurav Dev, and I'm the founder and CEO of Scientific Dialogue. Today, we have with us Dr. Ahyan Panjwani, who completed his PhD in economics from Yale University. And now he's working in the Financial Stability Division of the Federal Reserve Board. So, Dr. Ahyan, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
All right. Sir, firstly, I wanted to ask that what was that time? What was that point in your life when you decided that you wanted to become an economist and particularly become a PhD economist?
Mhm. Yeah, so I actually did not take economics until my freshman year in college. That's the first year in college. So O A levels वगैरह जब मैं कर रहा था तभी I actually took economics in O levels and दो दिन पढ़ा था privately and then decided it was way too boring, or at least the way it was being taught was way too boring, dropped it and instead took accounting actually, and thought that was more interesting. Like, just imagine that, how how boringly it was being taught. Anyway, fast forward, went to college as a math physics major, like most guys from Karachi tend to do, and then I took economics का जो पहला introductory course होता है as an elective, to satisfy some requirements, and lo and behold, it seemed really interesting. Not only did it seem interesting, but truth be told, taking derivatives is much easier than taking integrals, right? Econ's all about marginal stuff. Physics, on the other hand, you had these shapes and stuff, and you have to integrate over that in some electromagnetic fields, and jo bhi kuch hota hai wo. So I decided that econ was slightly easier, pays better, and so might as well do that. So I guess that was an economist or an econ view of the world, to do something that there's less cost to it and more benefit to it. So I guess at a meta level, I was thinking about my own choices about pursuing econ versus physics through the lens of an economist. उस वक्त अंदाजा नहीं था, but humans, that within humans there's this tendency to do that, when that's fine. And then once I started studying more of economics, it became more interesting. Obviously, our own sort of upbringing in Pakistan, you constantly hear about the economy or the lack thereof. फिर मुल्क तारीख के नाजुक मोड़ से गुजर रहा है again and again, right? So growing up, you obviously have this idea कि यार economy हमारी क्यों नहीं चलती है, इंडिया की क्यों चलती है, and so on. So got interested in that, got interested in macroeconomics. I had some great professors. I do think teachers have a huge, almost an outsized role in determining what a student ends up doing, right? So the subject might be interesting or not. So I took econ in O levels for a few days. I didn't find it interesting. The same econ, the same production possibility curve or what have you, at a later date, being taught by someone else, piqued my interest. So that's where it sort of starts to get into economics, thinking about how humans behave, realizing that economics is actually not about money. It's about how humans respond to whatever's in front of them, constraints, opportunities, and so on. Getting interested in that, getting into macro in particular, because how do individuals' responses to constraints, to opportunities, and so on, aggregate up to some macro phenomenon. And then from there, just decided that, okay, let's pursue this further and apply it to PhD programs at the end, in the last year of my undergraduate studies. Got into a few of them, and then decided to, go where I did, and take it from there. I don't think there was like one big point up where I decided, oh, let's do a PhD in economics. There was a one specific moment where I decided, okay, let's go into economics instead of physics or math or what have you. Yeah.
And how was your experience like doing a PhD at Yale University?
Right. So that has been, if I were to say a life-changing experience, that would be an understatement. Like, I mean, let's just backtrack, right? Like growing up in Karachi, I went to the Lyceum for my A levels, went to Bayview High School for my O levels, and उससे पहले सारा कुछ. I could not fathom at that stage that there'd be a situation, that there existed a world out there, or a state of the world out there where I would find myself in that environment, right? And so, when I first got to the university, I was thinking of doing my PhD focused more in development and macro to some degree, but more primarily development. Having grown in Pakistan during the war on terror years, that had sort of had an impact on my worldview. And so I was like, why, how does all of this violence and terrorism and so on affect our macroeconomy, affect our trajectory as a society, and so on. So I started by being interested in that area of development in particular, then sort of thinking about long run growth and macro and the sort of development macro ideas. So dabbled with that. Then eventually I got into finance in my second year and learned a lot about that. Because coming from a liberal arts environment, I wasn't that well versed in finance actually. So I picked up a lot of it as I went along. And then the last act of my PhD was sort of getting into environment and climate change as well. So, there were these phases, but uska lubbe lubab ye hai कि in hindsight, sort of reflecting back, it's incredible how much I learned or how much a human brain is capable of picking up in such a short span of time. Because it's not just, these fields or isme kya ho raha hai, the technical skill set that you end up developing, right? So I barely did any coding. What I did in undergrad cannot be called coding really. And so picked up coding languages, Java, which is my primary language, Python, and then R and Julia. Those are sort of part of my skill set, MATLAB to some degree. But learning those tools to get to a certain, doing my own research and figuring out answers to some questions. So learning the research side of it, कि क्या क्वेश्चन है, क्या क्वेश्चन ऐसा है जो आंसर किया जा सकता है feasibly, right? सवाल तो बहुत सारे हैं, but you need a question that can actually be answered and so on. And then developing the skill set, the hard skill set and the soft skills to answer that question in a reasonable way, and understanding what's been done before you, right? Because you're not the first person in this subject area. पहले भी लोग आए थे, उन्होंने भी कुछ किया है. So building on top, as Newton says, standing on the shoulders of giants, right? So learning all of that, like as I speak right now, I can't, sort of imagine, a human brain is just such a powerful thing that it can do all of these things in a very short span of time. Like in the grand scheme of things, 4, 5, 6 years, not that long of a time, but to be able to pick up these soft skills, these hard skills, how to become a researcher, it's incredible. And given the audience here, I would say, for our students, A levels mein jo hote hain, to think broadly. I have a friend, he's doing his PhD in physics, and when he got into physics, he was like, मुझे तो पता ही नहीं था कि जिंदगी में कोई physics भी कर सकता है, right? The idea that the notion we have growing up is you do engineering or you do like business or whatever, but no, you can do physics as work. You can do economics as work, right? You can do history as work. So you can get into these things. And so, to the audience, I'd say just have a broad mind, especially students who are thinking who are interested in these subjects, but think there's no career path because I didn't know, but it's possible.
All right. And sir, just a short question. What would you recommend for high school students? Like, आजकल क्या हो रहा है कि high school students get into research, they decide upon a research topic and then learn all the hardcore skills जो कि जरूरत होती है जिनकी. So would you recommend that approach, या फिर पहले आप hardcore skills develop करें अपने अंदर and then go into research?
Yeah, that's such a good question, to be very honest. But it's like the chicken and egg question, really. कि पहले क्या है, मुर्गी क्या अंडा? The hard skills or the soft skills? For me, I think so. What's the ideal scenario? The ideal scenario is you get interested in some area, say math, right? You realize you're really interested in number theory, say, and then you read up, you get interested, you have some questions, and then you learn the hard skills, say Python, to answer some question in that area, right? And because Python or the hard skills or whatever coding, what have you, is a means to an end. It's not the end itself, right? So as you go along, as you need it, you learn the skill. But the reality is that there's just a huge payoff to knowing these hard skills in today's day and age, right? So if you know Python or Julia or what have you, there's just a huge payoff. So for high school students, A-level students, or O-level students, if I were them today, I would definitely invest more time in learning these hard skills, just because there's a huge demand for it, but also because there's a huge demand, means there's a huge payoff, but also because that opens a lot of doors now. And we'll talk about machine learning at a later stage. But having these tools can make you interested in certain areas, right? They can give you ideas about what's pursuable. What's important though is, and this I think is very critical, कि suppose you decide today कि यार मैंने Python सीखनी है, fine. Ideally, you shouldn't sit down over your summer break and learn Python by coding up tic-tac-toe, unless that tic-tac-toe is what you want to code up. You want to have a question जिसका आंसर बनाने के लिए, आंसर ढूंढने के लिए you learn Python, right? So have a project in mind कि यार ये question है, उसका ये answer है. Let's use this tool to answer this question that I have, right? Don't learn the tool. You don't learn how to work a screwdriver just for the sake of screwing or unscrewing screws, right? Like that's not, it's to build a cabinet or build a desk, right? कोई screwdriver या hammer ऐमे ही तो नहीं सीखता ना in vacuum. Python is the same thing. We get wrapped up, oh, मुझे Python सीखनी, क्यों? उससे क्या हासिल है? Because you're investing some time there, right? Make sure you're getting the most out of your own time.
And that is a very interesting narrative. And sir, so just wanted to move on with this कि आपका अभी जो काम है, that is in the financial stability division of the Federal Reserve Board. And so what do you essentially do there?
Right. So अव्वल तो ये कि मैं अभी start नहीं किया काम, that I start in August. So I can give you a brief overview of what that looks like. So basically, the Federal Reserve Board, that is the equivalent to Pakistan State Bank, right? So for those not in the know, it's the central bank of the US. उसमें the various divisions, some working on some sides of the economy. The one I'll be working in, financial stability se hai. Basically, the idea is to see कि जो financial markets हैं, कोई भी asset class हो, housing है, stocks हैं, bonds हैं, so on and so forth, उसमें कहाँ पे the vulnerabilities या risk के खदशात कहाँ पे हैं, and to monitor those and surveillance, right? Keep an eye कि कहीं किसी part of the financial system कहीं पे कोई risk इस तरह तो नहीं है जो हम नहीं देख पा रहे, that can get out of hand and so on, right? So it's a surveillance job. The division itself was created after the Great Recession of 2008, right? When there was a demand for policymakers to know and understand कि भाई financial risk कहाँ से आ रहा है, where is it emanating from, what can be done about it potentially, right? So it's one of the newer divisions there. इसके अलावा ये है कि despite being, as an outsider might think, okay, you're working at the central bank, you do some policy work, but a lot of time for PhD economists at most central banks, चाहे वो Fed हो या फिर Bank of Canada हो, Bank of England हो, a lot of PhD economists that are hired by the central banks actually work on their own research agenda, right? So very academic research they publish in the same journals as academic professors tend to do. And the idea is that these institutions want to have researchers who are who have an active agenda, who are on the cutting edge of research globally, ताकि कोई भी issues that are faced by the economy, these researchers can help you understand that and they know what's happening on the cutting edge, right? So these institutions, the point I want to make is, are as academically inclined for PhD economists, right? That's a subset. These central banks hire like a whole bunch of people, right? So not just PhD economists, they'll hire banking type folks, they'll hire legal, these have huge legal departments because they need to ensure that जो भी policy rollout हो रही है, जो भी actions ही जा रहे हैं, they're within the ambit of the law and etc. But for PhD economists, these central banks tend to be very much like academic institutions, academic environments, the way you direct your own research agenda.
And sir, so what was your research focused on? And also, before answering that, would you be able to highlight some of the key areas जिसमें economics, जितने भी economists हैं वो बहुत ज़्यादा interested हैं? So, for example, in computer science, we have quantum computing, जिसके बारे में हर computer scientist जो है वो there's a huge fuss about that. तो इस तरह economics में वो कौन से key areas हैं?
Right. So economics में these days, I mean, there's some very old classical topics. Old नहीं कहना चाहिए, some like topics that are evergreen. People keep working there, and there's still unanswered questions there. For example, why poor countries are poor, why Pakistan is Pakistan, right? Why is Pakistan not India? Or why is Sri Lanka where it is today, right? So those sort of classical questions you have. And then these days, I would say the areas of that are sort of happening and nine areas have which are getting a lot of attention. एक तो sort of climate change, environment econ has existed for a long time, but with a particular eye towards climate change. So climate finance or sustainable finance, there are various ways to look at it basically, but those that specific area is one. The other, I would say, is digital currencies, crypto, decentralized blockchain, although the whole ecosystem is not going through a great time right now, but the technology is definitely very interesting, blockchain, etc. And so a lot of research happening there. That's very new and nascent, like पिछले 3 से 5 साल के दरमियान it's really sort of come up. And then the last one I would say that's really sort of happening is gender and racial issues and the issues of diversity, right? So, for example, in America, the sort of statement that goes around is women make 70 cents on the dollar. There's historical reasons why certain socioeconomic groups do worse than others, and so what's going on, how can policies be made such that we make improvements on those disparities. So those are like the three sort of big areas that have received a lot of attention in recent years. Not all economists are working in that area, just like not all computer scientists would be working in quantum computing, but these are the areas that have captured economists' attention and imagination. And they speak to policy as well, right? So
आपने जो key areas highlight किए उससे मुझे एक चीज याद आई कि I recently watched a great movie on John Nash, and उस movie में they talked about his life and how he was a person with a different sort of a life, and उसको disease थी obviously एक, but he developed the game theory, एंड उसके बारे में उस मूवी के अंदर डिस्क्रिप्शन तो नहीं थी, बट ये कि मुझे जितना समझ आया दैट वाज बेसिकली कि ऐसा कोई इक्विलिब्रियम पोजीशन हो जहां पे एवरी पर्सन इज बेनिफिटिंग फ्रॉम द सिस्टम। तो उसको आप थोड़ा सा एलैबोरेट करके समझा सकते हैं?
Yeah, so basically, John Nash's big thing, it's called the Nash equilibrium. And the idea is that suppose there are two people, right? Let's just explain it by virtue of an example, right? Suppose India and Pakistan की मिसाल ले लो ना यार, ठीक है? Now, both sides, India and Pakistan, can say either we play, we nuke each other. Pakistan says we can nuke India or we can't, we won't nuke India. India says we can nuke Pakistan and we won't nuke Pakistan. And those are the two options that they have, either to use the nukes or not. Now, suppose neither of them nuke each other, right? Then both are better off, right? Because they haven't nuked each other. Well, that's a better situation than one being nuked, right? So that's one outcome. They can both not nuke each other. But then Pakistan thinks, कि भाई, what if I nuked India and India does not nuke me back, right? So in this case, Pakistan's better off because Pakistan's not been nuked, but India has been nuked, so India's worse off. And India thinks the same thing. India thinks, what if we nuke Pakistan and Pakistan doesn't nuke us? Then India's better off, Pakistan's worse off, right? And because of that, they're both like, oh, we should nuke each other. Pakistan thinks I should nuke India, and vice versa, because they don't want the other person to be better off than they are. And so they both end up nuking each other because that's the stable equilibrium. Basically, the idea is you want to be in a situation where if you deviate from the strategy, the other person cannot make you worse off, right? So it's a stable Nash equilibrium. That said, the reason why we don't actually see India and Pakistan nuking each other is because it's an ongoing, repeated game. What I gave you an example of is just a static, what's called a static game. Ek dafa mein decision le liya. But in reality, India and Pakistan, whoever has the button on the nuke button, has the hand on the nuke button, they are thinking about this on a daily basis, right? Aaj they decided, okay, let's not nuke each other. Kal they'll decide, let's not nuke each other. Because they know, okay, aaj, if Pakistan decides to nuke India today, India will probably nuke them and both will be worse off, right? So that sort of dynamic nature of reality means that we are able to avoid that really bad equilibrium situation where both nuke each other, right? But if it was, say, if it was end of times tomorrow, right? Dunya वैसी suppose खत्म होने वाली थी, right? Just end, the game ends, then both countries have an incentive to just nuke the other one today, right? Because कल तो होगा नहीं. अगर मैं आज इसको न्यूक कर देता हूँ तो कल तो मुझे न्यूक कर नहीं सकता because दुनिया ही खत्म हो जानी है. तो आज ही मैं इसको न्यूक कर देता हूँ. The other one knows के India knows के पाकिस्तान सोच रहा है कि आज ही न्यूक कर देते हैं. तो India also nukes today. Both end up in this disaster situation. But because don't have an end of time situation tomorrow, neither wants to nuke each other because they want to live to see another day, right? So in game theory, then broadly, there are these two kinds of games. One's a static game, कि एक दफा में ही सब, one and done. The other are dynamic games, which are sort of repeated dynamic games. We play a game on a daily basis, right? Which is really important in some social situations because your reputation is kind of built in this repeated game dynamic situation, right? Because reputation is built over time, right? A tuition teacher ki misal le lo, right? The tuition teacher could, really just do really poorly, right? And get all that money. एक month की उन्होंने fee ले ली, and he taught really poorly, and then game ends. He decides to go out of business. Well, he would because no one would come back, but he could only make that amount of money that he did. But because he wants to make that amount of money every month, he will try to work hard to make sure students keep coming back to him, right? Because he'll develop a reputation over time कि हाँ यार ये सर गौरव जो है वो एक अच्छे टीचर हैं पार्क स्टडीज के और whatever, इनके पास जाना चाहिए. But that's only because students and the teacher play that game again and again. Same with hospitals and so on, right? So anywhere where reputation or trust is commitment is involved, you have these repeated situations. When Nash equilibrium becomes more complicated in static games, it's very easy to see कि क्या होना चाहिए, right? And then obviously there's games where the equilibrium is not clear कि क्या होना चाहिए, or it involves some randomness. So for example, what's the Nash equilibrium for rock, paper, scissors, right? So it turns out that in rock, paper, scissors, there's not one concrete Nash equilibrium. There's no, Nash equilibrium in the sense of pure strategies. It doesn't say, oh, we should just play scissor every time. The idea there is that with 1/3 probability, you should play rock. With 1/3 probability, you should play scissor. And with 1/3 probability, you should play paper, right? So you need to randomize there, and that's the Nash strategy. But we're getting a bit too technical for podcast, I feel.
No, sir, I think it was exciting. It sounds interesting to me.
It really is. It really is. And, this whole area of game theory, it's really interesting, really exciting, especially when you're on the younger side. I feel like it's got some appeal to it. And I hope, people from, our A-level schools tend to pursue these things. It's a fascinating world on its own. Yeah, because then, you can think about, oh, okay, chess में क्या होता है? How can you figure out the Nash in chess? And it turns out it's like complicated to the point where it's just unfeasible to just brute force your way through to the strategy, and then you need some learning, and that gets machine learning involved and computers having to learn, which is information theory as well. So Chris Shannon, who worked on information theory, father of information, he has some work on this area, get chess mein, how can a computer figure out what the right move is, and we can talk about that at more length. So my research is primarily in the area of macro and finance, which basically thinks about, so, people, the audience has probably heard macroeconomics and finance within econ in the last 10, 15, 20 years, especially since the Great Recession. It's existed, but there's this renewed attention to the field of macro finance, which thinks about how financial markets and the macroeconomy are interlinked, right? Because think of a household, right, that has to decide how much money to save, and when it decides to save, how much to put in the stock market, how much to hold in bonds, how much to just hold in hand, how much cash to hold in hand, right? Those are financial decisions, but they have a macroeconomic effect as well, right? So the linkage is very important. And so my research focuses on that area, broadly speaking. And right now, I am currently thinking about how climate risk affects these linkages, right? So there are two kinds of climate risk. One is physical climate risk. So think about droughts, hurricanes, typhoons, flooding events, sea level rise, right? These are physical changes in our ecosystem, and that can affect households living in that area and hence affect their financial decisions, which would then affect the macroeconomy. On the other hand, you have transition risk. So transition risk is the idea that as the economy goes from using fossil fuels to greener fuels, that can affect the macroeconomy as well, right? So people are currently driving a a traditional vehicle, right? And then they make a switch to using an electric vehicle. That involves a certain amount of money they have to pay, that involves a certain transition for the fuel industry from going from oil वगैरह to electric, right? Electric means more copper wires, which has an effect on copper mining, right? And so you have all these sort of knock-on effects, right? So that's transition risk. Right now, I'm focusing more on the physical risk side of climate risk. And so my thesis, my primary paper was about how certain federal policies in the US have encouraged home ownership, encouraged households to buy homes in areas that are more exposed to flood risk, right? To rising sea levels, to hurricanes, and to floods in that sense. Because the idea broadly is that there's some subsidies or some benefits that homeowners, when they take out a mortgage, can get despite taking out a mortgage in a high flood risk area. And so the idea is to figure out what these incentives are, what these subsidies are, how do they affect households' decision making, and what kind of household is being incentivized, right? So are these subsidies or these incentives that the government is giving out, are they driving very rich people to buy, beachfront, oceanfront villas in Florida, or is it incentivizing poorer households to buy homes that might be more exposed to flooding along the Jersey Shore or something, right? And it turns out, well, the rich would have all bought a house in the Florida coastline anyway. The government subsidy doesn't affect their behavior as such. It adds to their benefit, but it doesn't determine their final behavior. They would have bought the mansion anyway. It's these households that are poor and have high credit scores, meaning they're credit-worthy households, but they're poor. They are the ones who are really incentivized to buy in risky areas because of these subsidies and incentive structures. Now, that's one side of things. On the other side, think about a homeowner in Karachi, DHA में ले लो, DHA phase 5 में किसी को ले लो, and think of a homeowner along the Jersey Shore, right? So these are two people, they own their houses, and they are exposed to rising sea levels, floods, and so on, right? Vagaries of climate change. अब जो बंदा कराची में है, या जो बंदी है कराची में, उसने वो घर खरीदा हुआ है, से वो 5 करोड़ का घर है, ठीक है, डीएचए में 5 करोड़ का घर मिल ही ना जाए, बट तस्वीर कर लो, ठीक है, उन्होंने वो 5 करोड़ का घर खरीद लिया। कल को से बहुत ज्यादा बारिशें हो जाती हैं, जो कि कल हुई भी, और हर साल अब तो मतलब ये ड्रामा चलता है कि बहुत ज्यादा बारिश हो जाती है, एंड शहर के कुछ नशे भी इलाके हैं वो डूब जाते हैं, और ये जो डीएचए का 5 करोड़ का घर है, इसमें डैमेज हो जाते हैं, राइट? उसका बेसमेंट पानी से भर गया, लाखों रुपए का नुकसान हो गया, सो ऑन. बट लेट्स मेक आवर एग्जांपल वेरी सिंपल एंड इमेजिन अ वर्ल्ड वेयर द स्टॉर्म इज सो बैड कि वो 5 करोड़ का जो मकान है वो खत्म हो जाता है, फ्लैट, राइट? सो दैट बंदी हु ओन दैट एसेट इज आउट 5 करोड़ रुपीस, ठीक है? Now think about the person in New Jersey who owns a home, 5 करोड़ का ही लगा लो, $2.5 लाख बनते हैं, ठीक है, 200 के हिसाब से, तो $2.5 लाख का से घर है. अब वो बंदे ने उस घर में 20% सपोज डाउन पेमेंट दी हुई थी और 80% मॉर्गेज लिया हुआ था, मीनिंग दे बोरोड 80% ऑफ द हाउस वैल्यू, keeping the house as collateral, and from their own side they put 20%, right? So 20% of 250 कितना हो गया भाई? 10 हो तो 25,000, 50,000 हो गए, ठीक है? उसने $50,000 लगाए थे, जो कि 200 के हिसाब से 1 करोड़ बनता है, और बाकी उसने बैंक से लिया होता. नाउ सपोज हरिकेन सैंडी कम्स इन, जो कि 2013 12-13 में आया भी था, and that house is demolished, right? Khatam ho gaya wo ghar. Wo asset is gone. That homeowner is now out that 20% equity that person had in the house, right? So that is $50,000. Okay. That person lost $50,000 or a crore versus the Bandi in Karachi who lost 5 crores. So what happened there? This physical climate risk really did a number on the person in Karachi who owned the whole house, right? Because usne sara risk liya hua tha. She was exposed entirely to that risk. Because the New Jersey guy had access to a mortgage, he was sharing the risk with the bank. And in fact, the way mortgages work is that the bank had passed on the mortgage to some investor, right? So the risk actually got diversified. Yeah.
तो mortgage जो उसको देनी है बैंक को तो उसमें कोई changes नहीं होंगे.
Right. So for simplicity, just assume that the person New Jersey वाला जो है वो default कर जाता है, right? Because वो भर ही नहीं है, वो it's like मैं mortgage भरूं भी तो किस चीज के लिए जो चीज exist नहीं करती, so say he defaults, right? To keep things simple, which does happen, by the way. It's not that far removed from reality. And so the point is that that person walks away having lost, $50,000 in जो भी उसकी equity थी, right? Whereas the person in Pakistan, because वहां पे फाइनेंशियल मार्केट्स नहीं थी, वहां एक मॉर्गेज मार्केट नहीं थी, is more exposed to physical climate risk than people in geographies where you have robust financial markets, in particular mortgage markets, right? Because when you have a robust mortgage market and a mortgage-backed securities market, securitization of your mortgages, what that means is that the bank does not keep the mortgage on its books, it actually sells it off. Okay, so to investors, right? To pension funds, hey, whatever. So I'm simplifying some stuff here, but that's the gist of it. The idea is that financial markets can help diversify this risk, which is geographically very concentrated, right? Because flood to Hurricane Sandy, New Jersey, New York में, वायोमिंग में नहीं आया. तूफान जब कराची के साहिल से टकराया तो उसने DHA phase 5 में तो तबाही की है कराची के काफी, मगर लाहौर was fine, right? But there's no way for the homeowner in Karachi to share her risk and reward with an investor sitting in Lahore, right? Because we don't have a robust mortgage market. So anyway, that's another project that I have where we think about how financial markets can be used to diversify with climate risk. Because financial markets का मकसद काफी हद तक ये है to diversify risk, right? You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. But the way जो हमारे यहाँ पे एक बहुत ही robust real estate market तो है, plot तो हम सब करते हैं, ठीक है, मगर that means you are putting all your money in one asset, which goes against the notion, a well-accepted notion in financial economics. You want to diversify your asset portfolio, right? हम तो एक ही घर में 5, 6, 10 करोड़ डाल देते हैं, and that hurts middle class types more. Poorer, conditional on being a homeowner, it hurts the poorer more. Why? Because poor जो है उसका तो सबसे बड़ा एसेट ही, अगर उसकी वेल्थ 100 रुपए है, उसमें से मोस्ट लाइकली 80 रुपीज तो घर में ही लगे हुए, 10 रुपए का उसने सोना खरीदा होगा, 10 रुपए की उसकी गाड़ी होगी, ऐसे ही कुछ एसेट मिक्स होगा, राइट? द बिगेस्ट एसेट इज द होम, एंड वो इतना एक्सपोज्ड है to these vagaries of climate change, right? And now you can start thinking about कि जो हमारी कच्ची आबादी होती है कराची में है, काफी हैं जो कि इन चीजों को एक्सपोज्ड हैं, राइट? अक्सर बेशतर डूब जाते हैं. तो वहां पे तो उन लोगों के प्रॉपर्टी राइट्स भी सही से डिफाइंड नहीं है, बट वैल्यू तो है घर की. इट्स दिस सॉर्ट ऑफ hodge podge of things going on there, and we need to think about people's exposure. You can कल को you will find a way of solving or protecting Pakistan from climate change, right? You're like, you go up to the government, you're like, भाई मुझे 100 करोड़ रुपए चाहिए, and I have this idea that will protect Pakistan's coastal line, or at least Karachi, from climate change, from sea level rise. The question is, कि भाई तुम्हें 100 करोड़ रुपए देना बनता है कि नहीं, कि हम तुम्हें दे तो दें बट उसका बेनिफिट क्या है, what is the value of assets at risk? We don't even know that. We haven't figured. I mean, it's easy to figure out. There's some machine learning involved, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, what is the value of assets at risk? And that's leaving alone the sort of natural endowments that we would be protecting, right? जो हमारी wildlife है, marine wildlife है, हमारे mangroves हैं, etc. Mangroves तो बेचारे जो रह गए, मगर protecting that is on top. But just core assets हम कितना save करें, हमें वो ही अभी तक नहीं मालूम. तो before we implement any adaptation policy, any mitigation policy, की तरफ हम वसाइल लगाएं, हमें पहले मालूम तो हो कि हम बचा क्या रहे हैं. So those are like the big themes of my research, and there's something along farming as well, but I think we'll talk about that at a later stage.
I think this makes a lot of sense, and I understand the importance of this subject. But sir, I also want to know what were the techniques that you applied to conduct this research.
Right. So here, the techniques I applied are basically twofold. You can break economics into two areas. One is sort of theoretical modeling of economies, and then you strip down the world to its bare basics, जो चीज आपको चाहिए होती है, to figure out कि अगर मैं ये चीज इस इकोनॉमी में चेंज कर दूं, मैं अगर इंटरेस्ट रेट इस इकोनॉमी में चेंज कर दूं, तो हाउ विल पीपल रिस्पॉन्ड, राइट? वी कांट, एज इकोनॉमिस्ट वी डोंट हैव अ लैब आउट देयर जहां हम इंटरेस्ट रेट चेंज करते हैं एंड सी what effect it would have. So we create these theoretical models which is just a bunch of math equations, but those equations, it's literally a system of simultaneous equations at the end of the day. But those simultaneous equations embody the sort of thought process of humans, how humans would respond to certain changes in parameters, right? So it's at the end of the day, it's very basic, but obviously gets much complicated. And then solving those systems of equations require, sometimes you can't solve them just by hand, oftentimes you can't. And so you need computational power to numerically solve these systems, which is something I do and do in Java. So that's one tool of solving these computational models, these theoretical models computationally. And then on the other side, you have empirical work with data work, right? You take data from the world that we have, and you try to discern certain patterns, trends in the data. You try to establish causality. X policy caused this Y phenomena that we observe, right? So you want to see what's happening in the world, use that to motivate your model, jo aap likh rahe ho, your theoretical model. But now, once you have the theoretical model, you want to be able to switch some things around, which you couldn't do in the empirical, right? Empirical is from the data that was generated by the world that exists. राइट, इस दुनिया में पाकिस्तान में इस वक्त 14% का मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी रेट चल रहा है, समथिंग लाइक दैट, राइट? वी कांट चेंज दैट, बट वी कैन यूज दैट टू क्रिएट अ मॉडल, एंड देन इन द मॉडल वी देन चेंज, ओके 14 का अगर हम 20% कर दें, 6% कर दें, तो हाउ वुड पीपल रिएक्ट, हाउ वुड इन्फ्लेशन रिस्पॉन्ड एंड सो ऑन, राइट? सो that's the sort of workflow that you get. The data work, the empirical work, broadly falls within the umbrella of what's called econometrics, which is bringing stats to economics. And within that, there are certain strategies that people use. There are basically three of them. One's called difference and differences. The other one is called instrumental variables, and the third is called regression discontinuity. These are all techniques used by economists who try to establish causality, right? So we want to be, at the end of the day, ideally we want to say that smoking causes cancer, right? But it's not as straightforward as is. You need to make sure you can really say that yes, X causes Y. And so there are these strategies in econometrics, which is a subfield of economics, where we think about very carefully how can we say X causes Y by comparing two groups. एक में, one group smokes, the other one doesn't, and then we compare outcomes for those two groups and see that yes, the group that where we had smokers, they indeed they indeed get cancer more often. But you could argue, well, the two groups, one group ऐसा तो नहीं है कि maybe they're also eating really bad, right? Whereas one group is sort of going for a run every morning, eating vegetables and not smoking. Then you can't compare outcomes for those two groups because they're just so different. The only difference you want to have is that one group smokes and the other one doesn't. And on other dimensions, those people are the same. Then you can isolate कि हाँ भाई सिर्फ smoking की वजह से in logo में cancer हुआ, right? So it's very difficult to establish that, but that's what economists try to do using these three strategies. So I use one of them, difference and differences, in my work, establish some trends and some facts that we see in the real world, use it to what's called calibrate my theoretical model, and then within my model, change a few things, apply some policies in the model, see how the outcomes change, and that allows us to say, oh, agar policy maker X की बजाय Z करता, तो Y की बजाय W होता, right? So that's the kind of analysis.
Alright, so मुझे आपके theoretical model के बारे में एक सवाल पूछना था कि how many parameters did you take into account and वो कौन से parameters थे? And secondly, आप जब किसी भी रिसर्च पेपर को पढ़ते हैं तो आप क्या चीज देखना पसंद करते हैं? किसी इंसान ने 10 पैरामीटर्स लिए हुए हैं या फिर किसी इंसान ने 3 ज्यादा अच्छी क्वालिटी के पैरामीटर्स लिए हुए हैं? Does the quantity matter या फिर जो क्वालिटी होती है उन पैरामीटर्स की?
I had a few parameters, about 7 of them that I calibrated and using essentially a Monte Carlo-esque method. I don't really try to go into labels because physicists' notion of Monte Carlo might be very different from what econ people think about Monte Carlo, even though at the end of the day it's the same, but just the way you conceptualize it is different. But I use what's essentially a Monte Carlo method to calibrate those 7 parameters, right? And so concept parameters, those are parameters of the sort suppose एक household है, how much do they spend on their housing expenses every month, right? So what fraction of income goes into their income? That's not the exact one, but I'm trying to give you a sense of what kind of those parameters look like, right? I don't think they actually teach like utility maximization in A levels econ, do they? I don't think they do that, where an agent has a utility function. Do they? That's a question.
I don't think so.
Yeah, so then it becomes very challenging, right? But basically, the idea is that the agent has or household has a utility function, which given apples and oranges, मुझे 2 apple और 3 oranges दिए, मेरी ये utility थी, it gives you a number, and you want to maximize that utility, right? You want to have as much utility or happiness, whatever is possible, subject to some budget constraint, right? मेरा कोई constraint होगा ना कि मेरी income 100 रुपए है और एप्पल की प्राइस 10 रुपए है और ऑरेंज की प्राइस 12 रुपए है, तो मैं given those prices and that income, how can I maximize, what combination of apples and oranges will maximize my utility, right? So the idea here is, given some income that I have, how much should I be spending on consumption of apples and oranges, जो हमारी राशन है, versus घर के एक्सपेंडिचर, मॉर्गेज पेमेंट या रेंटल पेमेंट, राइट? मुझे कितना रेंटल पे खर्चा करना चाहिए और कितना मुझे एप्पल्स ऑरेंजेस राशन पे खर्चा करना चाहिए. So how do I break that up? So the parameters in that, right? That depends on how much I like housing versus how much do I like going out and partying, right? So if I like housing a lot more, then I'll spend more on rental, right? If I like eating apples more, I will spend more on apples, but I'd have to calibrate my utility function accordingly, right? So those are the kinds of parameters that get calibrated. And there's a whole science behind how this stuff happens. As for in the literature, obviously it's important to have fewer parameters. Fewer the better, but obviously there's a trade-off, right? The fewer the parameters, the worse your fit will probably be, the fit of the model to actual data.
Yeah, your cost function become larger, I guess.
Exactly. But on the other hand, if you have 1,000 parameters that you want to fit, then you run the risk of overfitting, right? You can 100% fit the data, but then any policy experiment you do, is that actually reasonable? Not really, right? So there's a trade-off there. What's important is to be transparent. Okay, so a lot of these papers, especially one that have like lots of models, lots of parameters, they end up being what's called a black box, right? कि अंदर है क्या पता ही नहीं चल रहा. So 10 हो कि 50 हो या 2 हो, what's important is to be transparent कि what's going into your model, because at the end of the day, model is just a function, right? It's like f of x and it spits out something, right? It takes in something, spits out something. So you want to be transparent about what's going into it. Well, everyone's very, transparent about what's coming out of it, sure. But just be transparent about what the inputs are and where they're coming from. And I think that's fine, right? So what's more important, really, along that line, is transparency and clear writing, right? And so just being very clear and transparent in your writing, in your exposition about what is going on in the paper, right? You can try to obfuscate stuff and try to create these blockades for someone's understanding if you are trying to be sort of wishy-washy about what's going in your model. So just clear writing can help with transparency. So write it as simply as possible, right? Just like Occam's razor, right? The simplest model and not simpler. That way, it's for writing as well. कि आपने page नहीं भरने. My advisor in undergrad said this, and it stuck with me. कि Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate, he writes a paper that's like 30 pages, right? So you and I can possibly not have more to say about something than Paul Krugman, right? And so our papers should not be like 60 pages or 90 pages or what have you, should be smaller. That doesn't always work, but it's a good concept to have in head के यार अगर पॉल क्रूगमैन इतना बड़ा होके 30 पेजेस में अपनी बात कह सकता है, तो मतलब मैं भी कह ही सकता हूँ, मतलब उससे ज्यादा तो कहने के पास मेरे पास कुछ है नहीं. So yeah.
All right.
And I think that this is one thing, by the way, I'll point out, that our students have seen really, they're wanting is writing, being able to write well. That is unfortunately a skill that's really lacking. And I've seen, I've hired students who worked on projects for me, and during that hiring stage, I have indeed seen that writing is some place where we can really use a lot of work. We have this habit of sort of writing very long passages. I don't know where it comes from. Probably the way we're taught. It's not our personally. फर्द वाहिद का मसला तो नहीं है. It's the education system. It's like page bharo and superfluous, right? Like extra verbose, बहुत ज़्यादा. Said, the idea is cut it down, cut it, right? Get to the point. Yeah.
Okay. Now I think it's the right time to talk about Pakistan. So, sir, what's happening in Pakistan? The petrol prices are going like insane. So, what's the economic point of view that you would like to share?
Yeah, truth be told, आपके और मेरे जाने से क्या ही हो जाएगा? They call me a skeptic or a pessimist, but I think I'm a pessimist at heart. And बहादुर शाह जफर ने कहा था कि ये चमन यूं ही रह जाएगा और हजारों जानवर अपनी अपनी बोलियां बोल के उड़ जाएंगे. तो आई थिंक दैट्स पाकिस्तान रियली. क्या आप और मैं भी कुछ कह के निकल लेंगे, बट आई honestly, it's Pakistan has gotten itself into such a corner that is getting out of this hole mess is challenging. And I feel now, this is totally armchair stuff, right? Like it's very hard to sort of separate an objective economist from your own country, your own home place you've called home. Um, so sometimes I do feel that our response every time we've been in a tough place has been to dig a deeper hole, hoping to get out of it the next time, right? Um, Everyone talks about structural change. It's like कान पक गए हैं सुन के स्ट्रक्चरल चेंज. बट क्या है ये स्ट्रक्चरल चेंज? किस चिड़िया का नाम है ये स्ट्रक्चरल चेंज जो हमारे हत्थे ही नहीं चढ़ती? Like petrol prices, that's just a symptom, not a disease. The dollar exchange rate, people talk about के कल का क्या रेट होगा और गोल्ड का ये रेट होगा, etc. And stock market आज 900 पॉइंट ऊपर गई तो कल 400 पॉइंट नीचे गई. Those are all symptoms, right? What's the big issue? The big issue is that the productivity hasn't gone up, right? Sort of policy preferences are so skewed, so skewed. It's incredible. खास तौर पे जहां तक ये रियल एस्टेट की बात है, right? And everyone talks about this problem कि भाई रियल एस्टेट का you just have this debt capital basically sitting there instead of money capital being allocated to productive activities. You have it just khali plot or अब तो plot भी नहीं बल्कि फाइलों पे people make a lot.
और सर ये सेम चीज सर बट ये सेम चीज जब लंदन और न्यूयॉर्क में होती है, वहां पे भी रियल एस्टेट में बहुत ज्यादा लोग इन्वेस्ट करते हैं, तो वहां पे ये मसला क्यों नहीं आता?
Right. So no one's saying that people shouldn't invest in real estate. You shouldn't be incentivizing that, or you shouldn't be subsidizing that investment, right? If every few years there's an amnesty scheme type thing, right, on real estate, then that's an added benefit, right, towards real estate investment. फिर वो बंदा क्यों ही जो है कत्लख्वारी पालेगा कोई फैक्ट्री शैक्ट्री लगाने की, मतलब अगर वो उसमें जो है प्लॉट लेके और फिर वो कम टैक्स में उसको करा भी लेगा जो भी. And the problem really here is, given how skewed and messed up the incentives in the real estate sector are, it's become increasingly prohibitive, I would say, not difficult, but almost prohibitive for young people in Pakistan, like white collar professionals who don't have पापा का पैसा या मामा का पैसा वाला सीन, तो खुद जॉब कर रहे हैं 9 to 5 or whatever. It's increasingly difficult, almost prohibitive for them to get their own house, right? So think of two young couples. One is working 9 to 5, a white collar job. 9 to 5 तो होता नहीं, 9 to 8 कर लो, whatever. And there's another couple, जिसमें the parents have a factory and उन्होंने बच्चे को भी फैक्ट्री करके दिए या वो बिजनेस फैमिली बिजनेस चल रहा है जो भी. नाउ वो जो फैक्ट्री वाले फैमिली है वहां पे वो नए कपल को एक घर भी मिल जाएगा. दिल बाय इट ऑल कैश, प्रोबेबली 6-8 करोड़ का तो घर मिल जाएगा आराम से. व्हाइल द यंग कपल, they're being taxed heavily, right? Income tax उनका तो tax force जो होता है. And they're facing all these obstacles towards home buying. They can't build that asset, whereas जिसके पास है वो एक और asset खड़ा कर रहा है. And so over time, what my concern is that this real estate का जो हमारे यहाँ ड्रामा है, उसकी वजह से you'll have this intergenerational inequality, where educated types who are working 9 to 5 will not be able to build this asset that some others are able to, right? And you will have this divergence within the society, and you'd have the thinning out or the emptying out or the hollowing out of the middle class, right? And that is very alarming, because that then creates all kinds of issues of lack of vibrancy in this civil society, all of lack of freedom, etc., etc. But the point is that this real estate thing it has gotten out of hand, and it keeps getting more and more out of hand. So we really need to think about कि हम किस तरफ जा रहे हैं with this whole plot thing. We've lost the plot line, I feel, for our country because of this. What to really do about it? I mean, we can talk about what should be done. Is it going to do anything. I'm a skeptic and a pessimist, man. मेरा नहीं ख्याल कि what will I can tell you what will happen. What will happen is that we'll sign with the IMF again. We have to. There's no way out of it. We'll try to do the reforms. We'll try to do this. We'll have a few good quote unquote years, stable years, and then we'll go back into the same issues in the near future. I honestly, um, I don't see much hope. I think we've been on a downward trajectory, a mild downward trajectory, and I think we'll just stay in either plateau from time to time with a dip and then plateau and a dip. And that's unfortunate that it's that way. I wish I had better news, but it's just unfortunate.
All right. So, sir, just want to mention two examples. So, I don't know if you know about Habib University, which has a new model of philanthropy. So, for example, Pakistan में क्या होता है कि रमजान के अंदर people donate for a lot of causes. But उसकी वजह से क्या होता है कि आप ऐसी चीजों में इन्वेस्ट करें जो कि लॉन्ग टर्म आपको कोई फायदा नहीं दे रही, आप शॉर्ट टर्म चीजों में दे रहे हैं. एज इम्पोर्टेंट एज इट इज, साथ में आपको इंस्टीट्यूशनल बिल्डिंग पे भी काम करना है. सो फॉर एग्जांपल हबीब यूनिवर्सिटी क्या कर रही है कि जो पाकिस्तान की एलीट क्लास है उनको कह रही है कि आप डिफरेंट कॉजेज के लिए वैसे ही डोनेट कर रहे होते हैं, तो हाउ अबाउट यू डोनेट फॉर अ यूनिवर्सिटी जो कि इसी तरह का प्रोग्राम लॉन्च करिए. फॉर एग्जांपल एचयू टॉप्स जो कि लोकल बोर्ड से लिए गए टैलेंटेड बच्चों को अपने प्रोग्राम में फ्री ऑफ कॉस्ट पढ़ा रही है. सो एक तो पहली चीज इंस्टीट्यूशन बिल्डिंग के बारे में आप बात करें.
So on institution building, and this is a good model. I will say that जो Habib University वाला है. Habib University itself is a great institution. They're doing some fantastic work. Shout out to them. What in terms of institutional building, this is such a slow process, but really needs to happen. And more so, ये जो भी LUMS fee hike वाला चक्कर चला हुआ था कुछ दिनों पहले, is endowment building. Because what that is taking the model you just said a step further. Okay, suppose Ramzan mein you donate 100 rupees to Habib University, right? And then Habib University uses that, or Habib University, I pick on Habib University X jo hai, that takes that 100 rupees and puts it in a scholarship fund, and then that scholarship fund is used to basically fund students next year, something along those lines. What ideally would happen, and this is a much slower process, but would make the institution that much stronger, is that it takes the 100 rupees from you, pools it with other donations that it's getting, right? Let's say you're the only donor, takes your money, invests it, maybe in the stock market, maybe lends it somewhere, whatever, government bonds, I guess, something. And then, suppose unko return out 10%, right? So 10 rupee return out there. And then use that 10 rupees to fund a student the next year. Yes, that means smaller help right now, right? 100 rupees se ho sakta tha wo 10 student ko help kar sakte at 10 rupees a student, but now with 10 rupees ka return, they can only fund one student. But what that means is that 100 rupees is protected, right? वो principal जो है, मुद्दल जो है इन्वेस्टमेंट का, वो वहीं बैठा है, और जो रिटर्न है उससे आप काम करें, because over time that pot of money will generate you more, not just generate you more, it will increase in value as well, and you will have an institution that is able to weather crises like the one we have, right? LUMS fee hike jo hai, that blow could have been much shallower had LUMS been, or a university like, सब LUMS में तो fees नहीं बढ़ाई होंगी, सभी ने fees बढ़ाई होंगी, inflation है तो, though university, the institution would have been able to shallow that blow by because it wouldn't be so reliant for its operational expenses on tuition fees, right? Because their operational expenses are being funded through your tuition money, they have to keep, they have to increase salaries, obviously, so they have to increase tuition as well, which affects all students. And jo amir student hoga at university, they won't have any issue, but jo bechara gareeb hoga wo mara jayega. But if they had a pot of funds jiske return se they were able to fund students, that would be extremely helpful, extremely progressive in terms similar to progressive taxation, right? Because then you could target कि भाई इस student को हमने help करना है and so on. So that will take a long time to, it's a slow process, but it would make the institutional foundations that much stronger and really sort of make sure that we have these great institutions, right? IBA, LUMS, Habib, other schools that can really sort of become, the kind of institutions that will last a long, long time and are providing the kind of education that we need as a society and to students who deserve it, right? Like, and so one might say, well, this is the American model or whatever. Yes, it is. An American university is successful, right? So have at it. And it's not just for these, like other institutions that have similar objectives, say in healthcare, also, or it's usually these teaching institutions, but for academic institutions that should have this model, so they can be independent, right? And their academic objectives are not being impressioned upon by monetary pecuniary concerns, right? That's very important. तो उन institutions की खुद मुख्तारी के लिए जरूरी है कि उनके पास ये endowment model इस तरह का हो. Just take Yale for an example, right? University was founded in 1701. Today its endowment is like close to $40 billion, right? So that's like incredible. And it's able to fund, a huge chunk of its annual expenses through returns on that endowment. Now, it happened over 300 years. In particular, most of it's happened since the late 70s, early 80s. But 80s से भी लगा लो तो 80s से आज कितने साल होंगे 40-50 साल बन गए, right? It's taken 40-50 years to just do that in a stable environment like us, in a stable environment like the US. It would just take a lot longer in Pakistan, but you'd have an institution that's on solid ground, right? So yes, the model that you highlighted is a step in the right direction. What I would ideally like to see is one step further along the endowment model, because as is oft quoted, people in Pakistan do give a lot, right, in charity, and we should be leveraging that. Why? Because the huge difference between a hedge fund and an endowment like the one I described is, say you donate to a university, right? You give 100 rupees. You can't ask for that back. If you invested that money in a hedge fund, you can redeem it, right? आप कल को जाके NIT वालों को बोलो भी मैंने 100 रुपए म्यूचुअल फंड में लगाए थे मुझे वापस दे दो. University को तो donation देती है, it's gone, right? So they can actually do very long-term investments without the fear of being redeemed. And so that allows these universities to really, become engines of sort of this endowment model and be on strong footing. They have the benefits going for them just by virtue of the institution. And so I think they should really think along those lines. It's tough. It's tough. I know that. But I think if these institutions want to be like independent and khud mukhtar, then they really need to think along those lines.
I think this was very insightful. Just the last thing that I wanted to talk about is one of your research papers that is on the effect of banking intermediation on agricultural outcomes, and it has evidence from Pakistan. Can you talk a bit about that?
Right. So that project basically entails this idea of working with farmers, providing them with inputs as opposed to cash loans, right? So you, instead of giving them 100 rupees, you give them seeds and fertilizers worth 100 rupees. And then you tell them or work with them, you need to sell your crop to this buyer. The buyer commits to provide whatever market rate is going on in the market at that time. And then the buyer routes the funds through the bank that had provided the loan. Okay. So we work with the bank. The bank provides a loan in kind, not in cash, and then works with the farmer and the buyer to get the buyer to route the money through the bank. So the bank can make its recovery and then pass the proceeds on to um, the farmer. The idea there is to basically create a mechanism where you take out the inefficiencies in the system, you provide favorable terms to the farmer, but also one a huge roadblock in agricultural lending in Pakistan is कि suppose एक farmer आता है आपके पास, it's like okay I want a loan for 100 rupees, you're like okay अपनी जमीन को collateral रखवाओ, right? अब जमीन को collateral रखवा भी दी और कल को वो default कर भी जाता है farmer, suppose getting land, you know, recovering that land because that's collateral, the bank should get it and sell it off, but that's a nightmare of a process, right? Because you are stuck in courts, land markets are not very thick, and so actually selling it off, it is a pain in the neck. So then that discourages lenders, formal lenders, from going into this segment anyway, right? So the idea is instead of that, use cash flows from promised cash flows from the farm as collateral instead of land, which is more liquid, it's easier to work with, and so on, right? And so you try to make more robust supply chains and at the same time solve this collateral issue in Pakistan's agriculture market.
But sir, एक चीज आप highlight करके मुझे बताइएगा कि for example, if the loan is given at a time जहाँ पे let's say wheat की price है 10 rupees, for example, and जब harvest होने के बाद उस wheat की price 15 rupees हो जाती है, would the जो bulk में जो इंसान buy कर रहा है, would that person be ready to give that extra 5 rupees?
Yeah. So it's set not at that time. So it's whatever the current market price will be in that at that time, right? So जब हार्वेस्ट हो गया, से जुलाई में हार्वेस्ट होती है, right? Suppose, तो उस वक्त जिस दिन the farmer takes the crop to the buyer, the day they transact, whatever the market rate is, they just get that. So it's in the spot. Even if it was being decided at the start of the harvest, which is where I would ideally want to see the market, कि January में तय हो कि हाँ भाई जुलाई में ये price पे हम transact करेंगे. But that price, you project it. You wouldn't take the spot price in January कि उस वक्त market में क्या rate था. You'd say कि भाई जुलाई में अमूमन 16 रुपए होता है, हम 16 रुपए पे कर लेंगे, right? But you lock in the price then, and that you might say कि well, you know, the farmer might be shortchanged because हो सकता है उस वक्त मार्केट में 20 रुपए हो, अब उसने 16 पे प्रॉमिस कर दी, मगर हो सकता है उस वक्त 12 रुपए हो और उसने 16 पे प्रॉमिस किया हुआ है, right? So there is some gamble in that, but it takes away the risk कि अब फार्मर को जनवरी में मालूम पड़ जाएगा कि भाई मैंने 16 रुपए में बेचनी है, तो मैं इस पे इतनी इन्वेस्टमेंट करूं. इस वक्त ये हाल है कि फार्मर जो है वो 100 रुपए इन्वेस्ट करते हैं बीज खरीदने में या जो भी इनपुट्स उसको चाहिए, ट्रैक्टर है, दिस दैट, वो खरीदने में उसने 100 रुपए इन्वेस्ट कर दिए, उसको प्राइस गारंटी तो नहीं है ना कि इस मेज की क्रॉप से मुझे इतना मिलेगा. In the case of wheat, the government announces a support price, but that creates other inefficiencies. यहाँ पे imagine a forward contracting market. I want to imagine a forward contracting market where the farmer can lock in a price. कि भाई 16 रुपए में मैं बेचूंगा. He doesn't have to lock in his whole crop. अगर वो 100 मन की उसकी expectation हो, हाँ भाई 50 मन जो है मैं 16 रुपए पे लॉक कर देता हूँ. And बाकी जो है मैं उस वक्त spot में I'll gamble on it. I'll take some risk and I'll mitigate some risk, right? That's diversification right there. So allowing farmers to diversify their risk, especially given the amplification of climate risk, right? Droughts and heavy rain, right? The farmer is just open to that. Farmer की खुद की crop effect होती है, सारे farmers की crop effect होती है, the whole price goes down, right? And that really can do a number on that local community. This way, you at least have कि हाँ भाई अगर मेरे पास 50 मन आ भी गई तो इतने तो मुझे मिल ही जाएंगे, इससे कम भी हो सकता है, ज्यादा भी हो सकता है.
All right, sir. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I think this was one of the most fruitful conversations I've had in a very long time. Just any ending remarks from your side?
I just hope that students, particularly, thinking back, OA level के जो हमारे students होते हैं, since I went through that as well, they should really, think about learning some technical skills. जो coding की हमने बात की, there's GitHub, there's LaTeX, there's R, Julia, etc. These are extremely handy tools, so they should think about learning some of it. सारे करने की कोई एक सीखो. In a systematic way to answer a question, the way we discussed, how one should go about learning them. Spend a summer doing that, right? वैसे ही फारिग ही चल रहे होते हो. So do that. That's extremely important and has huge payoffs in the future. So, and that's something where I think our students lack relative to the same Indian students that I see. And I hope we can play some catch up there. That's one big part, yeah.
All right, sir. Thank you so much. Let's hope for the
Mhm.
best and good luck for all of your future
Of course.
endeavors.